Have you been wondering how the Mac Mini handles gaming? Today we're going to take a look at some Apple Silicon optimized games, some Mac OS Rosetta games running under the compatibility layer, and even some Windows games using the base model of Mac Mini M4. So 16 gigabytes of unified memory, 256 gigabytes of storage. Let's check how this thing gates.
Okay, we're going to start with some Apple Silicon optimized games. So these are games that are specifically developed with Apple M series of computers in mind, and because of that, these are also the best showcases of what Apple Silicon Macs can do when games are targeting that hardware specifically. Now, I'm not going to have every single game here, but we do have a nice selection of games here, and we are going to start with pretty much the biggest game release for the Mac in past few years, Baldurs Gate 3. Let's see how the Mini M4 handles that. With this game, it's kind of hard to quickly tell any frame rate numbers that would be accurate because it heavily depends on where you are in the world and the camera angle you're looking at, so there are a lot of variables with Baldurs Gate 3. These are the settings on screen I'm using for this game. Unfortunately, the only upscaling method supported on Mac is FSR, and that is FSR 1, which absolutely sucks. So no Apple-specific metal effects upscaling, which would have been awesome to have, or even FSR 2, but no, we are stuck with native resolutions or FSR 1. Larian Studios behind the game have done a really good job supporting a lot of platforms and updating the game, but something I wish they would add for Mac version is the metal effects upscaling. Now, there is areas where Baldur's Gate can reach very high frame rate numbers with these settings, but like I said, it heavily varies depending on GPU and CPU load, but mostly due to GPU load when we talk about the Mini M4 base model. Now, once we get into a little bit more crowded areas, the frame rate obviously drops, but it still stays quite high with these settings. Image quality using 1080p resolution and balanced FSR 1 is not all that great, which is why I really wish this game had metal effects upscaling option or FSR 2. You can see the frame rate even spike up to 100 for a brief moment, but in general you can expect around 50 to 60 frames per second in areas like this walking around. Remember, all of the footage you see in this video is about 5 to 6 frames per second lower than it should be because of the internal recording I'm doing with the Mac Mini itself. Okay, here we are in combat with the exact same graphic settings, but we have bumped up the FSR upscaling from balanced to ultra quality to get a little bit better image quality and still being very playable, but for sure we have lost some frame rate with these settings. However, we are still staying just over 50 frames per second in this scene, but like I said, there are so many different areas and places you can go in the game, so you are gonna encounter places where the frame rate can be much lower or much higher. Now, we have so many games in this video that we have to move on, but last I show you some footage running again with the same settings, but FSR disabled, so we are running native 1080p with no upscaling. Now, this is very brief look at native 1080p here, and frame rate has noticeably dropped down, but in a game like Baldur's Gate 3, it is still very playable even with the lower frame rate. Personally, what I would do playing Baldur's Gate 3 on a base Mac Mini M4 is set the frame rate limit from the game settings to maybe 30 frames per second or 40 frames per second, and then adjust the settings in a way where it usually holds that frame rate and feels more consistent. But anyways, one of the best RPG games ever with so much freedom to do the things the way you want to do them, so can't go wrong with Baldur's Gate 3 on your Mac Mini, but just don't expect very high frame rates with this one. Resident Evil 4 here now, and we start with 1440p resolution using metal effects, performance upscaling here. This game offers only two options of metal effects upscaling, performance and quality, and we are using performance now. You can see the graphical settings on the screen as well. Now, once again, we are going to go through a few different settings here with Resident Evil 4, and again, all the graphical settings are going to stay the same as you see here, only resolution and upscaling is changed, and I will label them for you. Okay, as you can see, Resident Evil 4 running pretty good here with these settings, even though we're running very high resolution here, 1440p. Now again, with Resident Evil 4, there is going to be places and scenes where the frame rate is going to be lower than you see here, and also higher in some places, but at least this gives you some idea how the game runs with few different settings I used here. In order to save some time, how about we add 1080p with performance upscaling and native 1080p to the screen. otherwise using the exact same graphical settings, and you can see how they compare side by side. Take a look here. Now this footage here is not gonna line up perfectly here because that would take way too much time, and it already took forever to capture all the footage you see in this video, so sorry about that, but you can get an idea here how the game performs and compares using these three settings you see right here. Resident Evil 4 is a fantastic game with great combat, fun gameplay and impressive visuals, so great game to pick up and play on your Mac. Now, how about we move on and take a quick look at another Resident Evil title, the one that pretty much resurrected the whole series and is now also available to play on your Mac, Resident Evil 7. There are also, at the time of this video, Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 2 available, and those also play great, but here in this video we only have Resident Evil 4 and 7, but just know that Village and RE2 play well on your... Now, with Resident Evil 7 being a bit older game, originally came out in 2017 and got ported to Apple Silicon Macs recently, I was very confident we can go ahead and use some decent settings in the game and still get a good performance out of it, and that is exactly how it went. So here you can see the graphical settings used for this game, and it runs very well. If you want to play a really good survival horror game, you can't go wrong with Resident Evil 7. This game is easily the most scary out of the more recent Resident Evil titles and definitely leans way more to the horror side of the series compared to Resident Evil 4, which we also feature here, that's more of an action game. Both are great games in their own right and highly recommended by me. In Resident Evil 7, a lot of the gameplay is spent indoors instead of outdoors, where the frame rates are even higher. So what can I say? Resident Evil 7 runs fantastic on your Mac Mini M4, and you can play with the settings and adjust them to your liking, but here for this video example, playing with the settings you saw earlier and 1440p resolution with Metal FX quality preset, the game runs fantastic. And just to remind you again, all the frame rate numbers you see in this video are about 5 to 6 frames per second lower than what you are gonna have playing at home because of the internal recording I used to capture all the footage for this video. So again, keep that in mind. Now let's move on to different games. Okay, this one is going to be very brief. I just wanted to shout out this fun arcade game that recently got ported for macOS, and it has an Apple Silicon optimized version. This game is heavily inspired by Sega Saturn, which is a console I love, and this game is recreating that Sega Saturn look here in modern day, and I think it's awesome. The game is called Parking Garage Rally Circuit. It's a fun arcade racer with simple gameplay that's really fun once you start to master the mechanics of the game and become faster and faster. This game runs 120 frames per second, locked all day long, no issues whatsoever, or you could go also way higher than that if you unlock the frame rate. Okay, let's move on from this game, but check it out if you are a fan of Sega Saturn or arcade style racers from these days. Awesome little game.
Next up we have Lies of P, a Souls-like game. That's what people call these games, and this is one of the better games in that genre, and it also, from my experience, is one of the best Apple Silicon optimized games out there, with multiple different levels of Metal FX upscaling options, and in general the game just runs great. So here, first take a look at the graphical settings we are using, and these settings stay the same other than resolution and upscaling, and I'm once again going to put these side by side to save some time, so I don't need to show each setting separately. So here we have a couple different setups, and I have to say this game performs well on your Mac Mini M4, and it's only going to perform even better if you have a higher end Mac computer. The game itself, from what I'm hearing and what I have played myself, is a really high quality Souls-like game. So if you are a fan of Dark Souls games, Elden Ring, Bloodborne, Lords of the Fallen and games like that, this one right here offers a really unique art style and enemy types and some twists to the Souls formula, so highly recommended for the fans of this style of games. They just recently announced a expansion coming for the game this summer in 25, so there's more content coming out for the fans of this game. Now, As you can see, the performance when using 1440p and performance upscaling is pretty good, but it can definitely drop way below the 60 mark. But if you instead go for a 1080p balanced upscaling, you're gonna have a lot more frames. Meanwhile, the game is still gonna look pretty good. So there's a lot of settings you can play with in this game to get the performance level you are happy with. But with these two examples, you can see that this game runs pretty well on your base Mac Mini M4. And once again, remember, we are getting about 5 to 6 frames less here than without recording.
Okay, I'm gonna let this play a little bit longer here, and then we move on to the next game. This one right here is by far the most surprising Apple Silicon optimized game for me personally. If the fact that it's originally a hardcore PC military shooter isn't enough of a reason to be surprised about Apple Mac version, it originally came out in 2013. 7 years before even the first Apple Silicon Mac, and it finally got Apple Silicon version in 2024, so 11 years after the original release of the game, and this one straight away becomes the best hardcore shooter for the platform. Now, I don't know how much this game is still being played online, but just for the single player experience alone, it can be worth it if you want to play a very hardcore shooter on your Mac that's more of a thinking man shooter than your Call of Duties and such. Make any mistake here in ARMA 3 and you will end up dead.
Shit! Stop the truck, Carrie!
This game has so much different graphical settings you can adjust, but here you can see the settings I played with in this footage. Now, I first bought ARMA 3 back in 2014, and I do remember my at the time gaming PC heavily struggling with the game, giving me around 40 to 60 frames per second, and here we are playing on this super compact little computer with way higher performance, meanwhile also recording. It's impressive for a machine without dedicated graphics. Now, this game isn't state of the art in visuals these days, but it still can be worth it if you're looking for experience like this game offers. Very surprising to have an Apple Silicon optimized version, but it's welcome. Definitely check out ARMA 3 if the game looks interesting to you. Alright, so here I have 4 games in the same screen with settings I used and some footage of how the games perform. Please pause the video if you want to see the settings used, and I'm doing this to not balloon the video to be way too long, so these are last 4 Apple Silicon optimized games in this video before we move to Rosetta games. So we got Art of Rally, a fun indie rally game that runs great on M4. You can play with the settings and resolutions to get even 120 frames per second locked if you wish to do so. Then we got Valheim, a super popular survival game running just fine on Mac Mini M4, and again it's up to you to play with the settings and image quality to get the frame rate you are happy with. And on the other corner we have Prodeus and Civilization 6, both running just fine at 1080p resolution. Now let's move on to Apple Rosetta games. Okay, so these are games that are originally not developed with Apple Silicon Macs in mind, but instead for the Intel-based Macs. These games run under compatibility layer when played on M series Macs, so you are still able to play these games as long as they are 64-bit applications, because Apple Silicon does not support 32-bit Mac applications, so many Intel-based games cannot be played because of that, even with the compatibility layer. With these games you cannot expect the same level of performance than Apple Silicon optimized games, but these are also usually a bit older games, so even under Rosetta compatibility layer, most of them run fine, at least when we target 1080p resolution, like we mostly do in this video. Okay, so first up, a quick look at Rise of the Tomb Raider. Still a great looking game, and here you can see the settings I went with and how it performs. Now the beginning of the game is already pretty heavy on GPU, and we are around 50 to 60 frames per second for the most part here. And once again, remember that we are getting around 5 to 6 frames per second less here than you will without doing the internal recording. So for a 2015 game, I guess you could say it's not super impressive, but it's not a native game port, we have to remember that, for the M series Macs, and the game still looks really good. Now I'm sure you will encounter scenes where the frames get lower than you see here, but in general the game runs really well on the Mac Mini M4. Now quick look at the sequel, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and this game does not run as well as the previous one, but still it's more than playable if you're happy with the kind of performance you see here with these settings at 1080p. Both Tomb Raider games shown here are really good games and worth playing even today. Also, the first game in the series, 2013 reboot of the Tomb Raider, is available to play on Mac, and that also plays very well on Mac Mini M4 when I tried that outside of this video. Alright, now real-time strategy action here with Company of Heroes 2. Originally came out in 2015 for the Mac platform, and we are running the game here at 1080p resolution, and this game runs just fine on Mac Mini M4, but I did have a couple issues with the game. First, the menus using M4 chip for some reason ran at around 15 frames per second for me. Not a huge issue, but still worth mentioning here. And another thing I had an issue with is VSync. Even when I had VSync disabled, game ran at 60 frames per second and would not go over that. I don't know if there is a 60 frames per second limit on Mac or something, or in this game in general, but I was not able to get it running over 60 frames per second. Anyways, the Mac Mini M4 is more than capable to run Company of Heroes 2. Next up we got Dirt Rally. Now this was one of the better, more realistic rally games back in 2015, and it also had a Mac version of the game released in 2017. Most likely it is the best rally game on Mac. Now Codemasters, the studio behind the game, have released Dirt Rally 2 and gone on to make the EAWRC game since the first Dirt game, but those are not available on the Mac, and even this first game here may not be available to buy anymore unless you already have it in your library in Steam because of the license issues, I guess. This game runs like a champ on Mac Mini M4, and it's still a great looking and playing rally game, even if it isn't as good as Dirt Rally 2 or EAWRC games. As you can see at 1080p with the settings you saw earlier, this game runs super smooth. I was even a bit surprised how well it ran on M4, to be honest, so there is definitely headroom to higher resolutions also. Next we have Dying Light, once again a 2015 release, an open world zombie game with parkour mechanics, and a sequel, Dying Light 2, also came out a couple years ago, but that sequel does not have a Mac version. I played this game back in 2015, and one cool feature of the game is that you can play through the game in a co-op with a friend. Runs nicely on Mac Mini M4 with over 60 frames per second at all times during my short play with the settings you saw on the screen. I tried some city building next, so I booted up City Skylines, went with 1080p and pretty much high settings for this one, and of course this being a city building game, performance also heavily varies depending on how big your city is. So first what I did was just see how it runs as you are starting to build a new town, and the frame rate was over 60 frames per second no matter what I did when starting a new game, which is great. But I downloaded a custom map to see how the game would perform when you are hours and hours into your save game, and these numbers are very different in that situation. So in a big city with these settings, the game ran ranging from 30 frames per second to around 45 frames per second, so way lower frame rates, but still, in a game like this, it is very playable. And honestly, this particular city was very large, so it's kind of like the worst case scenario in this example here. So you can expect this kind of performance even when your city is absolutely huge. I think it performs well, especially because this is not a native port of the game. Okay, last couple games I tried. First, Batman Arkham City, running at 1080p, pretty much the highest settings, and I just booted up the benchmark mode, and the average frame rate was really high in Batman, and even at lowest it was over 70 frames per second. So you can go and save Gotham City on your Mac Mini at high frame rates. Now, the last game before a couple Windows games was Mafia III, still a decent looking game, and with this one, don't expect high frame rates. At 1080p high settings, the game was running around 30 to 40 frames per second once I got out to the city, so definitely playable, but getting closer to 60 frames per second, you would need to drop the resolution to 720p. Still, you can play Mafia 3 on your M4, and remember, once again, these games run under a compatibility layer, so we don't know how well Mafia 3, for example, would run if it was a native code to the AM series Mac computers.
Damn. It's not a fault, but not like you think. The conditions over there, man. Jesus Christ. One day you're raising cattle, tending your rice. Next day everything bombed flat. You put people up against the wall, they will do anything to survive.
God damn, that might have scratched the paint. Anyway, that better been one delicious fucking pig.
Now, at last, we take a look at few Windows games running on the M4. These games are running using an application called Crossover, which I believe is the most established compatibility layer when it comes to playing Windows games on an Apple Silicon Mac. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't say too much because even the best is still long ways from being anything too interesting in my opinion. For example, it completely refused to launch the first 3 games I tried to play: Elden Ring, Space Marine, and Returnal. So it's kind of pain in the ass and a crapshoot for the most part at the time of this video. Now, if you are willing to tweak some settings and preferences, then maybe you can make much more games launch, but no dice for me with out-of-the-box settings. However, I was able to play pretty much the biggest Steam game, Counter Strike 2, so that already can be a pretty exciting idea for many people, but there is a caveat. Not only does the game run very poorly considering the hardware, also I had issues with textures and absolutely huge stutters, especially early on when I started playing the game, because Crossover most likely needs to build shaders as you play, so that also means your games are gonna stutter all over the place when you first start playing them. Now, if you have some helpful tips and advice how to get games running better, please share it down in the comments. But for now, I personally would not really recommend Crossover unless you are ready to put in some work to get your games running and you understand that many games run way slower than the hardware quote-unquote should be capable of. Playing Counter Strike was an experience I would call almost unplayable for the most people. Now, obviously it was playable, but how many gamers are happy with under 60 frames per second performance with stutters in CS? I don't know. But the game just didn't feel smooth to play at all, but hey, at least it worked. Next game I got running was Beam.NG. Now, I don't know I don't even know how to best describe this game today because it got so much going on, from sandbox modes to racing to all kinds of scenarios, but the most well-known thing about the game is the realistic car behavior, crashes, and physics that are really fun to play with. And this game, again, just by looking at the frame rate, does not tell the whole story. Unfortunately, it feels a stuttery experience, but you can still play it if you really want to. Last Windows game in this video is Rocket League. Now this one I played through application called Heroic Launcher, which allow you to access your GOG, so Good Old Games Library and Epic Games Library, and I ran Rocket League once again through compatibility layer because the native Mac port of Rocket League is no longer being updated for a while. And in Rocket League with 1080p high settings you can get a high frame rate experience, which is nice. You can go and play Rocket League on a Mac Mini if you wish to do so, and you are ready to jump through a couple hoops to get it set up. So there you have it, guys. I know this was not a lot of Windows games here, but the crossover compatibility layer thing just isn't something that I wanted to play with, because I had so many issues with it. Games not launching, games not downloading, and all kinds of stuff like that. So until crossover gets a lot better than it is today, then I may actually be interested in it. But right now, not really interesting for me at least. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you appreciate the work put in here, give this video a like, and if you really want to support the channel, give this video a super like. I will not be doing a lot of Mac content, but I am planning on doing at least a PlayStation 3 emulation video at some point, with even comparisons to real PS3, so that should be fun, but it may be a long ways from releasing right now. With that being said, thank you guys, and in the meantime, maybe check out one of these videos. Bye guys.